Hello and welcome to a special edition to the War Report. It is a new decade, 2020. It's an election year too, which we'll get into. But we're not going to talk about the news today. We'll touch a little on some of the chaos that happened in Iraq over the past couple days. But mainly, I want this to be a year, nay, decade in review episode. Now we'll be focusing mainly on the events of 2019, but we will recall major events of this decade, such as the wars in Libya and Syria, the war in Ukraine and the seizure of Crimea from Ukraine, and the rise of China, rise of Russia, the Obama years into the Trump years, just a general looking back at the decade, maybe a little brief looking forward, what we expect for the 2020s and specifically this year, 2020. So I think the only proper place to start is this is the year of just complete incompetence, complete impotence of not only the United States but the West. The only Western leader I can think of that seemed competent at all on the world stage this year was Macron, and honestly, that's not saying much. You had Trump, whose hands have been now completely tied, as we saw probably last night. We have Merkel, who looks like she's on the verge of death. I mean, can you name? I mean, okay, Boris Johnson, he just takes power. He comes in on a sweeping election victory. Still hasn't done much with it. Theresa May resigned in May. But other than that, I can't think of any really other Western leaders that have made a mark. I mean, you had the populist governments, which, I hate to say it, but both fell apart in Austria and Italy. I mean, in Eastern Europe, things are still going strong with Hungary and to a lesser extent Poland. And you could argue even Zelensky is even inadvertently working out in the favor of the resistance to globalism or whatever you want to call it. Or he's definitely against the system, even if not by his own choice. Is what I'm getting at. But out of all the Western and European leaders, frankly, most of them didn't make an impact. But frankly, most of them also rule statelets, as you would call them. But yeah, like I said, I think Macron holds the title for this year, and I think honestly this will go down in history as the year of American incompetence. I'm not going to say it's on this level yet, but it reminds me of when the Soviet Union first started to slip and first started to really lose international credibility as a global power.
Yeah, and we say Macron because he's kind of changed his tune because he's paid attention to the changing winds. However, his country is embattled in a protest movement that's been going on for a year and a half. Yesterday, over 10 cars were set on fire on New Year's Eve. Uh, you know, uh, so you're right. It's not saying a lot. And yeah, the incompetence, and also really the hubris of American politics. Like, it doesn't occur, especially to Democrats, that the more they argue to get rid of Trump, um, instead of really, scouting that field that is partly progressive and partly fits within American geopolitical hegemony. Um, Instead of doing that, um, Trump is accused of being a dictator. That democracy is dying in America. I mean, it's not dying because of Trump. And so this kind of hubris that the rest of the world will just agree with them and not look at this as an internal weakness that's developing in the United States and will be a trend for the next 10 years is, I think, mostly why they're losing credibility. Besides, because, certain Western polities will agree or disagree of America's involvement in Syria, for instance. But in the end, should they leave, I don't think most of them would care. There would be a minority that would be vocal, and um, we would see the newspaper articles and so forth. But the truth is, most societies in the West, don't care if America leaves Afghanistan or not, and that includes its NATO partners as well. Just to give one example, but yeah. So I think the other issue is they will not take responsibility for the changes that are occurring. That is the beginning of the rejection of neoliberalism. This isn't to say that neoliberalism is weak and that it won't go into a more authoritarian stage. It will. However, Trump's election and his election victory is the way they seem to have decided to fight back against it. Because, of course, his rhetoric was and still is, except for maybe Ninth Circuit court judges and that kind of thing being appointed by him, it is the only effective thing that he's done, is voice this discontent that really had been brewing for some time. And so their inability to admit responsibility is also what drives this internal conflict and creates this sense of incompetency, and everybody senses it in some way.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And really, I'm glad you brought that up because it reminds me of a tweet I made a few months ago. Now, you had this resistor type saying, oh, well, Putin's saying the West is being destroyed by its own arrogance. And all the replies were like, well, of course it's a Russian plot. Trump's in office. And frankly, I know it's just a tweet, but it is a common mindset amongst a lot of liberals to the point where they just proved his point that they're so arrogant, they're so hubristic, that they think the only way America could decline is an elaborate foreign plot that involves a celebrity billionaire and the leader of a country that admittedly is powerful, but is nowhere near what it was even 30, 40 years ago. And again, we were going on the theme of American and Western incompetence and arrogance. And I think one thing that encapsulates that, especially with the United States, is not the tanker war with Iran, is not the whatever policy we're doing in Syria, is Venezuela. Because we've gotten to the point where we cannot get rid of a Latin American strongman who is losing control of his own country at a rapid rate. In fact, what we did actually bolstered his rule in that country to the point where, yeah, things have stabilized with the help of other international powers, that Maduro is still in power almost a year later as we speak. And to the point where the United States cannot pull off a simple coup in a country in its backyard. I think that does a lot of damage to our credibility that a lot of people are not seeing.
Yeah. Venezuela is a case in point. Of course, there's very strong interest for America to topple Venezuela, not least of which is hurting China and Russia in the process. But it is getting at the biggest reserves of oil in this hemisphere. But yeah, that hasn't been pulled off. The issues with Iran that go back with Obama's years, considering the Straits of Hormuz and so on, those issues are still there. Just yesterday, Iran pulled over another ship for suspected oil smuggling. Now, I think this was probably a valid charge of oil smuggling that does tend to happen, but that's exacerbated basically by the situation that has been going on there for at the very least 5 years in this kind of intense way. So yeah, there is that sense. The other is you can see that the U.S. Has two fronts. On the one hand, Trump is going to bring back nationalism, but apparently America's project of NATO is going to help legalize gay marriage all around the world. And so, I guess it's part of the whole Milo Yiannopoulos civic nationalism 2016 that it looks like he really did affect the power in the way that the alt-right or the rest of the alt-right could not. Yeah, and this isn't, this is starting to create doubts in countries like Poland, where they see themselves sandwiched between wanting to remain independent and at the same time, uh, having to pay their dues for having their independence guaranteed by great external powers. So, that's another trend that we're seeing. So, they've signed a deal for more missiles, and of course, they're also going to have to uh, accept more gay pride parades into ever more conservative geographies within Poland. Um, how are they going to handle this? I think in a way they've put themselves in a spot that I don't think they're going to be able to get out of. I I strongly doubt it.
Oh no, they completely wedged themselves in a position where they are they're screwed no matter what they do. And I'm glad you brought up the Rainbow Crusade, as we called it, because it was a joke. We had a lot of fun laughing at that, but it honestly was pathetic. And I think, looking back, even though it didn't get much attention beyond the initial weeks, that yeah, it probably did a lot of damage to U.S. credibility with some of these more conservative countries they need as bulwarks against um, Russia and or China. I mean, again, they're going to alienate Poland, probably countries like Turkey, which there's other issues with Turkey, but some of these other Eastern European countries. You think some of these Southeast Asian countries like Philippines, Vietnam, okay, maybe not Thailand, are really on board with this policy, and
Mhm.
I think even Korea is like if you look at the opinion polls, they're a bit more conservative on that issue. So it was just again, it was the biggest. There's no other word for it than virtue signal to that sort of civic nationalists like, oh, we're socially liberal and fiscally conservative, but we're the real nationalists, and anyone can be an American so long as they accept unfettered capitalism and gay rights. It was that sort of rhetoric, and honestly, it was the worst sort of surface level tier of Trumpism really taking over, but not even it's like a veil of that with the same neoliberal, neoconservative policies right under it. And again, it just goes to the theme of this year, which is American incompetence. And honestly, the theme of this decade. Now, I said, I can't name a single foreign policy accomplishment of the United States this year. I wouldn't go as far as this, but there weren't many this decade. There were probably some, even, despite your opinion on the Iran deal or some of the Cuba stuff, optically at least it was a victory, at least for a short time. Um, and you go into, yes, some of this other stuff. Uh, there were a few victories, but ultimately, this entire decade was pretty scant, especially compared to the 90s, the 2000s, even going back further than the Cold War, that we looked like an incompetent, dying empire because that's what we are.
Right. And there's other trends that we see accelerating very quickly. Some of the hope that there might have been in 2017 when some of the first waves of big tech censorship began to take place, that there would be quickly alternative formats would emerge, and that really hasn't happened. DLive, Twitch, and to a lesser extent BitChute so far are not really viable. And so I think we're going to see more, not less. We're going to see more censorship. We're going to see more laws that define any kind of ethno nationalism within the U.S. Punished, basically for secession against government, for as an internal threat to the unity of the United States. Because going forward, I think they're very well aware what the demographic conflicts are going to be. So I think if you're of European stock in the U.S. and in just about anywhere in the Anglosphere and in Western Europe, you're going to see more of this kind of censorship. You're going to see more draconian attempts to stifle us out, not less. And a lot of this is just anticipation because, you know, more than 50% of the population under 25 is no longer European. So I think the sense that there is going to be a conflict and that there's going to be tremendous instability. The other thing is probably to look at is, you know, in the last 10 years is the debt. No matter how good the economy may be doing right now under Trump and the new jobs that have been created, of course, this argument against that, that jobs because of tariffs with China have actually shrunk, or certain more skilled jobs. But, you know, since 1992, 93, 63% of jobs in America are minimum wage jobs. And no empire can keep this up indefinitely. The other is debt. As China's economy, if not gets stronger, but stabilizes, you can see that, you know, in the last 10 years, or actually you can see it better in the last 20, how many trading partners they've created over the last 20 years have literally taken over something like 80% of countries that once did deals with America. So the thing I see going forward is more authoritarianism in the culture with respect to Silicon Valley and whatnot, and those sorts of corporations. And at the same time, a greater militarization of the cities. Because if China emerges as a partner that other countries can deal with to build their infrastructure, if Chinese soft power continues to increase in Europe, they're going to play that off against the U.S. So I see, you know, a pretty dark picture for the next 10 years, primarily because the trends of the last 10 years were avoided, and responsibility for those trends was not taken into account. You know, such as, for instance, the disappearance of jobs. We have the new visas, for instance, for primarily Indian immigrants that are taking away tech jobs. You know, you can't have it both ways. You can't ask people who've lost their jobs to code and at the same time deny their, you know, those jobs to code.
Learn to code. Oh, hey, I know you've had this job for a couple months here, but you're gonna need to teach our new associate here how to do your job before we fire you. And you know, if you don't get your severance package. Yeah, it's that kind of stuff, and it encapsulates how, yeah, you have Donald Trump, who is this supposed nationalist who, oh, we're gonna put America first, we're gonna build the wall, we're gonna get out of these foreign wars, and all the points he campaigned on. And then in 2019 at a rally, he brings Modi up to talk about how great the HB1 visas are.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was getting at. It was HB1 visas. Uh, yeah, it's very frustrating because there's no sign of the, you know, conservative Inc. or the Republican Party for the most part being other than a vanguard to stop any kind of movement right of them, which will only allow the left to continue to win without even having to have a president in the White House. So, you know, I mean, most of the fear around Trump is really his rhetoric and the kind of feelings he stoked. It's not it's not anything else. And to be quite honest, he only capitalized on it because obviously his staff paid attention to where the fault lines and where the disgruntlement was held in 2015 and 2016. They were just simply being strategic about it. Um, yeah, so you know, um, I don't know. I don't know what to say going forward. It doesn't look that great. Um, the chances of conflict occurring I think is definitely possible at the end of the 20s and probably more so at the beginning of the 30s. Um, but all of this was because in the teens, sorry, um, everything was set in motion, and there wasn't, there was never going to be a serious debate about free trade and the way that worked. There was never going to be a serious debate about industry in the West and particularly in America. Um, so a lot of American power now relies on globalization, and for those who still, and it's understandable, who are Americans and root for America, I hate to break it to you, but it's not your America anymore. And it hasn't been for several years. If 3 years of Trump hasn't convinced you, I mean, I don't know what will. Um, but that impulse is still there. You can see a tweet about how great China is doing with the building of their infrastructure, and they'll say, "Well, it's just going to collapse in 5 years," or "Yeah, but I wouldn't want to live in communist China." It's like, are you serious? Do you know how relegated you are? Like how your opinions, your potential opinions, or your opinions that you espouse at home could come to work against you? Like this doesn't even seem to occur to them, because I think they're still holding on that things can be reversed, that somehow that there can still be legal immigration. And, the firestorm that's coming in the next 10 years won't happen because it's going to be legal immigration, right? So ultimately, it's this kind of faith in the ideology of America and faith in ideology altogether, right? Because, if you work towards government that doesn't get in the way of the people, and you do everything by the book, this kind of legalism jargon that's been sort of a mode within the West, for the last 3-4 centuries. As long as you do that, every pitfall will just be avoided. So it's like the naiveness is really extraordinary.
Oh yeah, but and you bring up a good point with China and how there's sort of this tendency on the right, even beyond the neoconservatives, where people who generally get it on a lot of the immigration questions and a lot of the other questions will still think that we're engaged in this massive Cold War, something you would have saw, 50, 60 years ago with China, because they're simply making investments in other countries while the U.S. is either sanctioning them or bombing them or not making any deals with them at all, and then complaining that China is filling that void to make trade deals, which we historically would have made or arguably should be making. And also, this idea that the rise of China is this great threat to American nationalism, when I would say more powers in the world is anything but. It would allow the United States to retract and focus more on self. Now, granted, as you said earlier, the neoliberals would use that as an excuse to pretty much go full police state. Some things that have been conspiracized about for the past 20, 30 years now, which as time goes on, they seem less and less ridiculous. But that's aside the point. But one thing I want to get into before we go on too long is just a look at the Middle East this year, and of course it is no less turbulent than any previous years, but I would say a lot more major shifts even than 2018. Now, of course, we had Syria, which uh, with the U.S. semi-withdrawal, I guess you could call it, with the I mean, of course, there's still in some parts of the country, but the role of the U.S. in Syria has been severely reduced. I mean, I don't have the maps on me, but you've seen the maps on how much Assad's territory has grown in former Kurdish-controlled territory. You've seen the Turkish offensives. You've seen Idlib. Nobody seems to be focusing on Idlib for now. I mean, now Trump came out the other day and saying, "Oh, it'd be a big mistake for Russia and Syria to attack Idlib because just think of the great human costs of all those empty hospitals." But people have been completely ignoring it beyond that. And Syria, I mean, I don't know if I want to go this far, but the war is all but over. I mean, once Idlib falls, that makes room for a most likely political solution in northeastern Syria with Turkey, the Kurds, Syria, etc. And again, that also goes back to the theme of U.S. incompetence throughout the decade. I mean, look at where we were 5 years ago, 6 years ago. It was still a brutal civil war. Now, you could argue about 6 years ago in 2014 with the initial rise of ISIS. It looked like Assad was done. It looked like Syria was actually going to fall. I mean, then you go on 5 years, you get into the Russian involvement. That quickly turns around, and just the. I think Syria, and I don't think this will be an unpopular opinion at all. I think I'm probably far from the only person to say this. Will be the defining event of the 2010s.
I agree. Definitely. I think you can see that there was this overall plan about how to surround and destroy Russia, and it begins a little earlier than 10 years ago, and that is it begins in August 2008 with the conflict in Georgia and the request of Georgia to rise to the level of NATO member. Russia dealt with that very quickly, very effectively. They had learned not to get bogged down. And to this day, 11 years later, Georgia is still not in NATO. Secondly, we have Ukraine. Ostensibly, the West lost Crimea and the ability to set a NATO base. Thirdly, in this great sort of chess game, what would have been a checkmate would have been the fall of Syria, and that would have landlocked Russia indefinitely with just northern ports and Vladivostok and so on, and that failed too. So on all three fronts, controlling the Black Sea, controlling Crimea, controlling the Eastern Mediterranean, in every one of these instances, the U.S. failed to surround Russia. Russia was able to outmaneuver them. Russia was able to counterbalance each of the efforts. You could even argue that cynically, Russia isn't even interested in Donbass. They're only playing it as a way of having a state within Ukraine that is anti-Ukrainian, that serves their purposes better. Crimea is of such value that using it in that way is impossible. It can never be considered. So Russia basically outmaneuvered them in that sense. And I think this also emboldened China. And it is why today there is, no one talked about BRICS, but people are talking about this kind of Eurasian pact of Iran, China, and Russia. That is the real BRICS, not the other one with some trade agreements that was, whose significance was either overblown or downplayed as a failure within, the articles in the New York Times and the Guardian and whatnot. So,
excuse me. You brought up BRICS. I believe the I stands for India, which, as we know, is the new superpower.
Superpower. Yeah, I mean it's another Aryan state, reaching the level of superpower. So.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if this one will make more than 12 years. We'll have to see.
Yeah, so I think that was also instrumental. I don't want to downplay, Arab Spring, for instance, and its significance and what it was supposed to do. Or how Syria fits into that scheme. I think a trend that we started to see in the teens and is probably going to develop further on is how, well, let's backpedal a bit. Let's say prior to 72, the main Arab country and influence within the Arab Muslim world was Egypt, until, of course, Saudi Arabia. and Saudi Arabia still has a very prominent position. But I think now we're seeing another country emerge, and that's Turkey. And Turkey is beginning to worry countries like Egypt, for instance, and control of the Eastern Mediterranean. So Turkey too is in a position where it's going to be of such value to NATO that NATO simply can't get rid of it or dictate to it what it wants, because losing it altogether is far worse for NATO than having it as a fair weather friend.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And speaking of the Middle East, speaking of big losers this year, I think one country probably takes the crown for that. I mean, between Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, who's the big loser of the Middle East this year? I think you know the answer.
Yes, I think I think I do too. Uh, uh, Israel?
Yeah, I think that's a good guess. You know, I wouldn't say definitively, but yeah, they did not have a good year this year. Not to get too far off track, because I do want to do a bit more of a serious analysis. But the funniest thing that happened this year, probably in like the news sphere to me, at least the world news stuff, is that Israel. They go on and on about how they're constantly under threat from Hamas, Hezbollah, and how we must defend ourselves, and that's why we need to bulldoze these villages, whatever. The one time Hezbollah pulls off a successful attack in over 10 years, they play it off like, we tricked you. You hit a dummy. Nothing really happened here. Like the one time they actually get attacked. Oh no, it
Yeah,
didn't happen. Nothing happened to us. But any other time Hamas sends a bottle rocket into Tel Aviv, it's gonna be a massive war, and Israel's gonna get wiped off the map.
yeah. Nothing happened, then begins to retaliate by bombing Syria. Yeah, it's just ridiculous. Yeah, I mean, they were one of those countries, like Qatar and Saudi Arabia and America, that were very heavily invested in Assad being toppled. Uh, and near the end, we can see that of all the countries that were invested the most in that, we can see that no country was more invested in the toppling and the destruction of Syria than Israel.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
it
even Saudi
simply,
Arabia at some point cut their losses this year. They said it's over, we're
yeah,
done. I mean, the Arab League reestablished relations with Syria, I think, in the summer of this year, summer or fall. But point
that's
being
right.
is,
Hello?
yeah, I'm still there. But yeah, the point being is, yeah, that Israel is just the biggest loser in the entire region this year. And again, all these theaters I just listed with them in, and not that's not even getting into the Iran stuff, how they've been completely rebuked, and not to mention the three elections in a row.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, I think they're very worried. They're worried about Iran's power and influence now. There really is there's no. Then this is what worries me for the next 20 years or sorry, the next 10 years is what a kind of high value priority it will be for many think tanks and many of America's political elite to go to war with Iran. Uh, because I think for Israel, the situation is becoming virtually untenable. Uh, a Syria that goes back to functioning, and an Iran that still remains highly influential within Syria and Iraq is, I think, has become intolerable for Israel in a way that it's not the case with Qatar anymore. Those differences from 2015 and 2014 over a natural gas pipeline have been more or less worked out. Uh, Qatar still gets to be this major exporter of natural gas. They're going to share the reserves within the Persian Gulf in that area where basically Iraq meets Kuwait and so on. And but I think for Israel, this concern isn't really. It's not about money at all. It's just about geopolitical strength and projection of power and projection of soft power. And expect craziness because if who is Israel going to rely on if America becomes more unreliable?
Well, I think you just brought a good point, and I think this meets my show obligation to bring up one Colonel Douglas McGregor because I somewhat agree with this take. There's a few things I would dispute, but pretty much he said, well, yeah, if the U.S. left Israel on its own, it might actually have to negotiate with other partners in the region.
Yeah, yeah, and who's going to negotiate with them? Like, I mean, yeah, Saudi Arabia, sure. Some other
Yeah, the
countries.
UAE, I think they actually are the only one like with official diplomatic relations. I know that
Yeah,
Egypt and Israel recognize each other ever since '79, but I don't think they have any formal diplomatic relations, like through embassies or anything like that.
yeah, yeah. So it doesn't seem very plausible. Yeah, and this is why I worry about like an inevitable war, because you can project into the next 10 years, and things aren't going very well, and uh, empires get worried. They get worried about their interests.
Yeah, not to compare it too much to the late stage Soviet Union, but I can honestly see a U.S. war with Iran being, ignoring our own Afghanistan, being our Soviet war in Afghanistan, where it's that one point where we finally just overstretch ourselves. We just take that one step too far, and we start to feel the repercussions of the economy on the world stage outside of that theater, etc. And I think, and we sort of saw this yesterday with, and the past few days with the U.S. bombing pro-Iranian militias harassing the embassy, and U.S. having to send like special forces in to secure the situation. That if a U.S. war with Iran is going to be started, which you know, a few months ago I would have said, oh no, there's no political capital, and Iran wouldn't go that far. It's going to be just those pinpricks until they eventually blow up to the point, no pun intended there, to where the U.S. is all of a sudden in combat with Iran, probably in the theater of Iraq. And it could honestly be qualified as Iraq War 3.0, where, yeah, we go in to fight these pro Iranian militias. Iran eventually sends in their regulars, and we're engaged in another guerrilla war in the desert, not against Saddam Hussein's forces, not against any of these other forces, but against an actual professional fighting force that would give us a hell of a run for our money and might actually be able to drive us out from the country.
Yeah, right. I mean, all of that is possible, and maybe maybe one of the reasons why there hasn't been a war with Iran yet is because there's a feeling that that would be the moment where the U.S. would overstretch, or it could be that America should prioritize its efforts in the Pacific with regards to China. China's influence is still strong there. It's another area where it seems
And they just did
conflict
joint military
would be
drills, I think, a
inevitable.
couple weeks back.
Yeah, yeah, and those islands, they are now beginning to have sophisticated anti-air defense systems. So um, and also the Philippines. Let's not forget that the Philippines had some of its territory taken over by China, and the Philippines sided with China after that because it looked at the U.S. as an unreliable partner. Now, this happened during Obama's presidency. However, that trend has not stopped with Trump in office.
Yeah, Trump has been, funny enough, a bigger paper tiger than I would say Obama, because Obama was sort of a he was pretty open about being like I don't want to say weak, but softer. I mean, look, we've gone over before. Obama was a big fan of soft power. Trump was going to be like, oh, we're going to be hard on China. We're going to, reassert America on the world stage, and then this happens. Now, going back to Iran, now they've all things considered done very well for themselves this year. Whether that be with the tanker wars, Syria staving off their own government instability, but I think we sort of went into this a few months back that Iran also has a tendency to overstretch itself, like we saw in Syria when protests broke out at home with the raising of gas prices, with the raising the fuel taxes. That yeah, Iran generally has stable leadership, generally has leadership suitable for the region, suitable for the situation. But don't be mistaken, they do have that tendency to overdo it sometimes. They think they
Hmm.
have more than they do, and uh, I think we see this, and I think an example of this that didn't really amount to anything is when they were on pretty much ready to go to war with Turkey over the Syria issue. Now, granted, like I said, that didn't amount to anything, but I think that is an example of where things lie.
I think that's a great point. That it's not it's hubris and overstretching uh, one's power isn't something that's particular to the U.S. It's been a historic reality for every country, and at various points in their history. So yeah, I agree with you that Iran seems to be very ambitious. I'd love to know, like, where is this coming from? Like on paper, it looks like Iran basically wants to like control Yemen around the Horn, and they're going to have a pivot point in influence in Syria. Wait, maybe Israel is right. they're blocking. Okay, you know what? I'm going to retract everything I've said for the year. But yeah, they seem very ambitious, and they're doing this with speedboats. So it ultimately it's very like it's also funny, the so I mean it's incredible offensive on Iran's part, and I think like how are they going to pull this off? Like it could, and it has almost come back to bite them. Like you mentioned the rise on standards of living in Iran, like well with gas and so on. Has produced these enormous protests, and they do have like a youth that's not quite like the youth of the 70s and 80s. So
Or even the youth
that
of Russia and China, for that matter, today.
right, and so that could be trouble for them in the future. But yeah, you know what? I don't understand it. The logic of it. I must say, it's very ambitious.
Now, I will say, touching on the Iranian youth and looking a little bit into the future, I see at some point in this decade, maybe the next, that the entity as we know as the Islamic Republic of Iran will not collapse. Pretty much all the same government institutions will stay in place, all the same systems stay in place. The Ayatollah, I think, will become more and more a ceremonial office akin to the uh, British throne or a president in some of these parliamentary systems in Europe. And I think what we're going to see is the rise of a military strongman in the position of president. And I would say that's probably Soleimani, aka the Shadow Commander, pretty much responsible for a lot of Iranian successes in Syria. And I think because what people think when they see these protests is, oh, the Iranian youth, they want liberal democracy. They want to be just like the West. Now, it's partially true. They want some Western elements introduced to their country, but they don't want to become France. They don't want to become the UK, Germany, or the US. They want to stay Iran. They don't want to be part of this globalized system, which finding out that's actually where a lot of the Iranian opposition for the JCPOA came from, that they didn't want to be conquered in a backdoor sort of way. So what I think you're going to get is I think you're going to get someone like Soleimani who isn't necessarily a Muslim hardliner, but is a hardliner when it comes to Iran in the region and on the world stage. I mean, that's the only way I can see Iranian policy continuing to be successful. I think that they're going to have someone like that in a more centralized system of control because for the Middle East especially, Iran is one of the more democratic countries. Believe it or not, they have regular elections. They have an elected parliament and elected legislature. Now, the role of that legislature, I'm not sure how powerful it is, but I think if they want to go forward, it's going to be a military strongman. And as I said, I think Soleimani is probably the most likely candidate for that.
Right. That may be a way that they realistically cope with the upcoming changes. You can see this in the kind of military that they have to use in order to project their power. It's the only way they can manage to do this is by working very closely with affected partners. So in Yemen, it's the Houthis, who themselves don't have a lot of power. However, they're very effective fighters, and they are bleeding Saudi Arabia right now. The other is working with Syria, where there are obvious mutual advantages to both of them. Lebanon is another example. So this is the way Iran finds its way to project its power, by working with people who share common enemies and with whom they also and or have common interests. So they're very clever that way. But I think the only thing that could change, say, the youth of Iran's mind about Western liberalism is to see Western liberalism begin to fail. Now, I don't know what the situation is like in Iran. In some ways, at this point in history, it would be almost better. Let's say that, let's make the presumption that Iran possibly finds ways to thwart Western media, certain propagandistic pieces, and so on. However, let's say it has the average person there has access to view the West with the way the West depicts itself during this time of great upheaval within the West. If it did that, you might have the situation that has begun developing in Russia. That is, in the last time that I visited Russia, which was this year, people were for the first time absolutely aware of the trans insanity that's going on, which was for them even beyond gay rights and gay marriage. So some of these countries could actually benefit from not having their own media become the dominant media. What I mean is, like, you can look at RT and Press TV, and they're always going to side with whatever group is going to destabilize America and the West. So their politics are therefore all over the place. They're left, they're right, and everything in between. Because the main priority is destabilization. It's just
It's the true
accelerating.
anti-liberal coalition we're talking about. Everyone from the communist Chinese to the conservative Russian to the theocratic Muslims in the Middle East to the socialists in Venezuela. They all hate liberalism.
Right, right. But what I mean is, if you just watch, like, if there are people, I don't know if they are, but if they're just watching Euronews, France 24, MSNBC, and so on and so on and so on, I think they could actually get a picture of how in trouble the West really is, right? Um, because then it would be kind of unvarnished, and like, you could look at it like, instead of looking, for instance, so, like, suppose you're talking about Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson, right? Press TV is obviously going to side with Jeremy Corbyn because, of course, they're going to side with Muslim immigrants, especially Shia Muslim immigrants within the UK, right? And they're going to spin that a certain way, right? However, if you look at it from the BBC point of view, which is mostly, like, most of the Western media is now polarized over, honestly, political parties and candidates that are not radically different from one another. So that shows a certain kind of crises. You see what I mean? Without, like, so people can ascertain um, what is sort of happening in the West. In other words, I guess what I'm saying, just the bottom line, just to end my rant here, is that the West is looking so bad right now that just watching Western media is enough to inform you. You don't need a spin on it.
Yeah, I've been saying throughout this past year, like, why aren't the Russian, Chinese, and Iranian media just playing clips from some of the social movements, any of them from the West, whether that be, I know this is going to be a bit outdated, Black Lives Matter, Pride parades. You really think that people with the mindset and culture of Russia, China, and the Middle East are going to be on board with what is happening in the American streets right now, or at least what gets covered by the media? I don't think so. I mean, I think you pretty much made your position clear. And I don't, I mean, beyond the most hubristic liberal who thinks the entire world is just on the brink of a liberal revolt, I don't see how anyone can really think that with a straight face.
Yeah.
Now, moving on a little bit, we're pushing up an hour, which is about when I want to go, maybe a little longer, keep it standard length here. Uh, some major events from this decade. I'll just do the broad picture. Yeah, Ukraine and Crimea. I mean, 2013, 2014, the Maidan sweeps Yanukovych out of office, and here we are today with Russia controlling Crimea, an extension on the negotiations. I mean, we're talking about how, oh, on December 10th they have to come to a conclusion, or else, very bad things are going to happen. Well, with Putin's meeting with Zelensky, where they negotiate the prisoner exchanges, they pretty much extend that another, I think, 5 years, somewhere in that ballpark. But I mean, Ukraine, it's, I would say, probably one of the biggest losers this decade. Now, of course, it can't compare to the destruction of Libya, which I would say is ultimately the biggest loser this decade. Probably Syria takes second place. Yemen, I would say a third, and okay, I'd put Ukraine in fourth because compared to those other actual war zones, Ukraine is doing pretty good. But in terms of the mass exodus people, that's where they really lose. I mean, they've lost like 4.5 million people since 2014. I mean, that's roughly a million a year, uh, give or take
Yeah.
some years. But I
And
mean,
they stopped reproducing at replacement rate over 20 years ago. So
yeah, like it, it's it's a nation facing demographic doom like no other in the world. And again, it's not because the people have stopped reproducing below replacement rate. It's also because of the mass exodus from that country.
yeah.
And frankly, the future does not look bright. We cover again and again that Ukraine has pretty much sold everything of value to foreign, whether that be foreign organizations like the IMF or um, countries like Germany. But Ukraine does not own Ukraine. And frankly, it hasn't really. But like I said, at least under complete Russian domination, there was some degree of autonomy. There was some, like, I mean, people recognize the Ukraine as, yeah, it's a distinct people with a distinct culture, and they live in this part of Russia, but they're still part of Russia. Whereas now it's this strong and independent nation that's controlled by the highest bidder, except Russia, of course.
Right. I mean, we could see some very interesting developments in the next 10 years if America continues to lose dominancy and influence and soft power within the world. We might see actual wars that change uh, territory in ways we haven't seen since World War II.
Yeah, I don't expect massive annexations because I think you got it right when you said that we're in the era of nation states, at least for the next century or so, where even if these countries do not govern their foreign policy or govern anything significant about themselves, countries like Lithuania will exist for the next century. They won't be annexed by any greater power. Countries like a lot of these Balkan statelets will exist, even though they'll practically be puppet states of whatever power just so happens to be dominant in the region at the time. But
Right, right, and that is because the mechanization, the automation of agriculture. That's one of the main reasons why territory was so important. But right now, basically, the way you rule is you rule with soft power, and you know, sorry, 19th century fanboys, but it's not in the long run that notion of self-determination, or at least the guise of it, has become so strong. In other words, republicanism since the French Revolution has become a kind of de facto good in the same way that democracy has been a de facto good. Although I think people are beginning to change their mind about popular democracy to some extent,
I mean,
but I
look
don't
at the
see
people
that
they vote
happening
for.
with. Pardon me?
Look at the people they use those democratic systems to vote for.
Right. But I don't see this really happening with republicanism. And really, you could argue, of course, that Crimea is an example that thwarts, that goes against this trend. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's a possibility, but I don't, the only reason Russia is capable of doing that is because of the vast majority of the population of Crimea is Russian.
Oh yeah,
So, um, and I don't see that happening. I just say it's a possibility. It depends on how chaotic it gets and how chaotic it gets and desperate in the next 10 years. A lot of this is just going to be based on economics and American power.
yeah. I mean,
Um,
redrawing of borders is going to happen mostly in Africa and the Middle East, if anywhere. And I will say this
yeah.
about Crimea: you were talking about soft power. Now, number one, I think it's proper to call this the era of protectorates because you have these on paper independent states, but are mostly governed by outside powers. I mean, look at the European Union, for example, or look at any of these other things. Now, Russia did a soft annexation of Crimea. Now, of course, they did the boots on the ground. They marched troops to the streets. Now, granted, troops that were already there because Russia has a long time military presence there. But point being is, you're also seeing them move towards this in Belarus. They want to sign the Union State Treaty. Now, Russia claims they're in the final stages of that, which I think they're probably closer to the final stages than most people would believe, but I don't think they're anywhere close to that. Now, I do
Mhm.
think it's very possible we will see unification between the two countries in the next few years, but I could see that. A lot of soft annexations, a lot of union treaties, things like that. Now, of course, Belarus again goes to the large Russian and Russophone population, but I mean, there's other places where that's the case. I mean, is maybe a less significant example, and there's more to it. But Romania and Moldova, I mean, we could see something like that. But
Yeah.
I think if there's going to be any violent changes to borders, it's again going to be Africa and the Middle East, possibly Asia, but I give less credence to that. But I think especially in Europe and the Western world, we could see a lot of soft changes, or even hell, even in the Middle East, we might see some soft changes. But yeah, ultimately, I do think we're in the era of protectorates where you're going to have this system of almost 200 nations that are on paper all independent and sovereign, but we all know how that works out in reality. But ultimately, I think, again, that's a very defining thing of the 2010s is this sort of, I don't want to call it a return to empires because that's not exactly what it is, but this return to as we've said multiple times, a multipolar world because, look, the U.S. is still on top. The U.S., even now in its most weakened state it's been in decades, still pretty much calls the shots around the world. But it faces significant pushback from countries like Russia, from countries like China, increasingly countries like Iran. Now, as time goes on, their power will likely increase as U.S. power likely decreases to the point where we're actually in a multipolar world, where there's this may be a bit of a stretch, a European sphere led by France or Germany, depending on who has the upper hand at that time. A Russian sphere that stretches into Eastern Europe and Eurasia. A Chinese sphere that's more likely than not friendly with the Russian sphere. And of course, the Middle East will be a battleground for influence, as we were saying. It's a new great game. Uh, yeah, but hell, I don't want to go this far, but we might see a South American sphere under Brazil, depending on the direction the continent takes. Now, the continent has seen a sharp rightward drift. Now, how much that's due to foreign influence is debatable. Now, Bolsonaro, he probably had some help getting in there, of course. United States being right there, having it right in its backyard, can very easily interfere in all these elections. But as we said, they've become sloppy, they've become incompetent, as we've seen with
Mhm.
Venezuela. But if Latin America, South America tends to take more rightward drift. Now, Bolsonaro has been on paper pretty pro-U.S. Now, granted, they had a spat with tariff things, But I would say a genuine nationalist instead of a half-assed nationalist like him might actually be able to form a cohesive um, Latin American or South American bloc out of all of this. And again, we could see a return. Now, I don't think it'll be this rapid. I think it'll take much longer than a decade. But the seeds are being sown. Things are being moved into place for this all to happen. And I think we'll see this in the 2020s even more than we saw it in the 2010s.
Yeah, that's a great perspective on the way these trends are developing. It is important to note that America is still the top dog, but I think part of the positioning that we're seeing, like especially with Russia and China, is they're aware. For instance, well, I mean, their media outlets are in the U.S. They're aware that infrastructure within the U.S. is falling apart, and I think that's partly what fuels, their big flex, their big push forward, their ability to make huge deals, and that America in the future is going to have to devote, more time to military, and more time to demilitarization, within the domestic sphere. Um, I think you could also argue that if Russia had muddled and failed in Georgia, Ukraine, and Syria, I don't think China would have been the partner that they are right now. I think that's something else that I think is going to leave us with the teens as we go into the 20s, is that that neocon notion that Russia and China are not really partners.
Yeah.
Or China's going to totally stab Russia in the back. Like, no.
Yeah.
Like,
I
I mean,
think we're going to have to wait until the
this for
2030s or 2040s, if
Yeah,
even.
yeah. I've been hearing this for 5 years, and I haven't seen anything that bucks the actual trend of where things are going. Um, it's sad because this is going to be a pretty rough ride. I think the next decade.
Yeah, and again, there's a few glimmers of hope. I mean, I would say more so in Europe than the United States at this point. And yeah, going back to that, I think even if Russia had those failures in Georgia, Ukraine, and Syria, that you think Hungary would be more likely to work with them. You think Italy would be more likely to work with them.
Yeah,
You think any of these other Eastern Europeans or Southern European countries would be more likely to work with them. No, they would
or
view them.
Turkey.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you bungle these interventions, you're just going to look like a brutish warmonger, like the U.S. has. Like, if the U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have been more successful, I'm sure we'd have more partners, even though, yeah, you can say on the surface it's wrong, we should not have been there. But if we actually made something of that and actually had some successes, it probably would have softened the blow. And, again, it probably did damage Russia's credibility a little bit to do these things that they've been doing on the world stage, but considering the fact they've been successful with them, it really softens that blow.
Right. I mean, there's I forget the adage, I forget the phrase about you know, you can do the wrong thing, but if you're successful, it won't matter. It's very pessimistic and cynical. I get it, but it is what it is. I mean, a lot of these states are going to look at this and see, can they pull it off? Can they succeed in stopping a southern flank from Georgia? Can they still hold the Black Sea? Because, of course, one of the important things for America is that it always has a new country where its ship can port. So America's presence in the Black Sea is 365 days of the year. But because Russia was able to pull these off and never get snagged in the process, that's why we see China, Turkey, and other countries begin to side with them. That's why Syria, as you said earlier, is in the Arab League once again. How different is this from 2015, just 4 years ago, when everybody was saying Assad must go? I don't recall that being. I think that was still said when in Trump's first year, but that was it. I think early 2017 was basically the end of that.
Oh yeah, I mean, because that's when the sod curse started kicking in. All of a sudden, these people who said that they lose their position of power, they wake up dead one morning, as it were, and yeah, all of a sudden, people stopped saying it. People stopped pushing for the removal of Assad to the point where even Obama, towards the end of his term, said it's not even worth it anymore. And speaking of Obama, I mean, I think this is proper. Last segment here to close it out. I think the Obama Trump dynamic to the point where, yeah, okay, in the 2010s, Obama got his second term. He rode in pretty much on the white horse, being the apex neoliberal. He was everything they wanted. He was a smooth talker. He had this feigned concern for the everyman. Oh, I care so much about the working and middle classes. Of course, he had the minority credibility points, like, oh, it's so wonderful to have a black man as president. We're so diverse and tolerant. That kind of crap. He got along
Yeah.
well with the other neoliberal leaders of Europe, whether that was Hollande in France or Merkel in Germany or Cameron in the UK, and he was the apex neoliberal. And then all of a sudden, you have a successor lined up here. You're going to have the first woman president. You're going to have Hillary Clinton, who has just these loads and loads of experience, former Secretary of State, everything you could ever want to continue this liberal system. And then a dumb orange billionaire comes out of nowhere and swipes it all away. Which,
he and Trump's election. Let's not forget Trump's election actually made the media call Obama what he really was, a conservative. We joked about headlines that would ultimately call Obama a conservative, and yet here we are. They actually did do it.
oh yeah, I mean, it is insane. Now, what's funny, even looking back, like how much I have soured on Trump, how much I'm guessing you have soured on Trump, and our audience in general have really turned against him and lost all hope or favor with him. I don't. Again, I couldn't ask for any more. I think that would be greedy, and I think that'd be unrealistic given our circumstances. And again, it boils down to rhetoric. The fact that he was able to come in and say the right things at the right time against a field of weak candidates, one of them who should have been a shoo-in because that's how weak the field was, Hillary Clinton, of all people, and he just comes along by saying just these simple. I mean, his entire debate performance was campaign slogans: "Build the wall," "Lock her up," "Bring the jobs back." It was all very simplistic statements. He didn't lay out how he was going to do any of this, and at that point, I don't think the American people cared because they were just looking for something different. And frankly, that's what a lot of them said. It's like, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the interviews they did, a lot of Trump voters acknowledged that they were taking a gamble. They're like, yeah, there's no guarantee he'll do any of this, but like at this point, what choice do we have? I mean, what's the alternative? There's no other alternative beyond this same slow, decadent neoliberalism that's been killing us for the past 30, 40 years. And funny enough, you had Trump, who was sort of an icon of the American neoliberal system. This quite literally a celebrity billionaire was the one who either purposely or inadvertently undid it all.
Yeah, Trump. Trump. I think it's better to look at Trump as, let's say, part of this indefined period from the 80s and 90s, and even part of the 2000s, a kind of ambiguous morality, which was a mixture of conservatism and liberalism before the real wokeness that began to accelerate and really take shape with Obama's second administration. And I mean that's sort of his background, where in his time that battle wasn't conclusive. By the time he emerged as a candidate, it was. And I'm not so no, looking at the election, I'm not so sure he's going to win, because part of the reason is the demographics have changed. He didn't really win by a huge margin. He didn't win the popular vote. I understand it's still an electoral college that's at work here. It's a republic, not a popular democracy. But I don't think his chances are as good as everybody makes them, because this is living with Trump as opposed to let's just give it a shot. So, you know, is there going to be the same kind of uh, enthusiasm that there was? Are people, like, I don't know if that's going to happen. And you're going to have a lot of people on the left, and you're going to have a lot of people on the left in various groups and demographics that are going to say anyone but him, anyone. I don't care who it is. I mean, in some states, in some districts, if a convict or a dog ran for the Democratic ticket in order to defeat, somebody loyal to Trump, they would literally just vote for them. That's how internally divided things are right now. So that I'm being a bit more pessimistic. I don't think his chances are gone. Don't get me wrong. And for instance, this impeachment thing, which was really what they wanted right from the time of his inauguration, um, it has boosted his popularity. Let's be honest. So yeah, that's kind of my take on Trump right now, and also that he is, optically speaking, he's bad optics following Obama as far as talking about where neoliberalism was supposed to be. And I guess that's the flip side, isn't it? That's the soft power side. The hard power side was Russia was supposed to lose in um, Georgia, Ukraine, and Syria. And soft power was it would be Hillary in office, and the soft and hard power messaging for the world, and in particular for Eastern Europe and China, would obviously lead to you to understand who the leader of the democratic world is, and none of that has happened.
Oh wow, it's gotten to the point where just talking about all this makes me miss 2016, 2017, where there was bright times and optimism ahead.
Yeah.
But no, in all seriousness, now granted there was admittedly a lot more optimism back then. I'm not completely black pilled. I'm not down for the count yet. Now I'm not going to speak on your behalf. But point being is, yeah, I agree that the enthusiasm for Trump has largely dissipated, and yeah, there's a lot of people who are vehemently opposed to him and will do anything to get him out. Now, I think if Trump can pull off one minor victory before any of this, he might be able to get it in the bag. Now, what that would be, whether that be like a troop withdrawal from some theater, whether that would be just a little bit of wall, a little bit of deportations. But one thing I think that would really throw a wrench in this is if they finally admit that Justice Ginsburg has gone the way of the dinosaur. Now, again, that would like radicalize both fields. Like, I mean, the entire election would be the Supreme Court battle. Oh, who's gonna replace Ginsburg's seat?
Yeah, excellent point. 2020 could be very lit if Ginsburg passes.
If they admit to it.
Yeah, that's right. If they admit to it, no, it will seem do or die for like many fanaticals on the left, because of course they really do live in this alternate universe where somehow 60% of the population is divided by 45, 55 is going to dictate to everyone else how to live their lives, and deportations will occur, like massive deportations, and death camps, and it's so utterly
Yeah,
ridiculous.
yeah, be
And
sentenced to 15 years of hard labor in Alaska.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's almost all, I mean, if you look at who believes this stuff, it's mostly well off retired
Yeah,
liberals.
it's the current elite. It's the people who benefit most from the system think that they're on the verge of just being persecuted and thrown into labor camps.
I know.
It's like it sort of goes back to like you get a lot of these, not to get too far off track, a lot of these like upper class Indian immigrants who are upper class in India, part of like the high caste, and they act like they're they're the most downtrodden people in the country. But yeah, it ultimately it goes back to the theme of the decade, which is liberal hubris, liberal arrogance, and its effect on the American empire, and ultimately the rise of Trump Russia and China really putting their foot down. Europe, for that matter, putting its foot down, whether that be the more established side of Europe, like Macron, or whether that be the firebrands in Europe, like Orban. I mean, Orban was, he tacitly criticized Trump without naming him, pretty much saying the U.S. is so unreliable. They change administrations every 4 years. We can't trust them. We can't make a solid deal with them. And he actually said that in one of his press conferences, I think with Putin. I could be mistaken there. And then you have Pompeo over there. Pompeo, the unspoken villain of this year. Saying, we're worried about Russian influence in the region. And I would say probably the highlight of the news year for 2019, aside from Israel's embarrassing defeat against their actions in Lebanon, is John Bolton is no longer National Security Advisor. That's all I have to say for the show.
That's right. There is a God. Don't mean to be glib about it, but yeah, him leaving office is amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, and like not those replacements like any stellar, but the point being is like I haven't seen one media appearance, anything of his
Mhm.
successor. I haven't heard anything from this O'Brien guy. Bolton, he was all over the place. He was at every foreign summit. He was at every press conference. He was always in the background. None of this guy. Now it could be that I just don't recognize him, but yeah, he's taken a pretty back seat. But point being is, John Bolton is gone, and that's one point of optimism you can look at going to the new year.
Definitely.
So thank you everyone for tuning in to our year in review stream. Hopefully 2020 will be as interesting and fruitful as the show is now. It's been great doing this show. For better and for worse. It's an interesting time in human history, and it's quite the experience seeing it unfold before your eyes. I mean, you read about these things in the history books. Yeah, they're interesting, but actually witnessing it yourself, especially in this age of communication, is something else. And out of all the drawbacks and negatives of the modern world, this is one of the positives. I'll say that. So hopefully
Mhm.
you guys will stick through us throughout 2020. Hopefully the show will last on whatever platform we're relegated to, because I think we're probably small enough to get under the YouTube radar. But they're going to come for all of us eventually. So we'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for your support too.